The void between stars had never felt so hostile as Captain Marcus Rodriguez watched the tactical display aboard the SCN White, humanity's most advanced dreadnought, show the approaching hegemony fleet in stark crimson dots that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. 300 alien warships, each the size of a small city, were bearing down on the Galactic Line, the invisible boundary that had kept the predatory Zephyrian hegemony from consuming the inner spiral arm for the past decade. Commander Jessica Thompson stood beside him, her knuckles white as she gripped the tactical console, watching long-range sensors detect energy signatures that defied everything they thought they knew about physics. The hegemony had been building something in the dark space beyond the outer rim, and now humanity was about to discover what happens when a species that had conquered 47 star systems in the past century decided that peaceful coexistence was no longer profitable. Lieutenant Tyler Brooks, barely 25 and fresh from the Naval Academy on New Geneva, couldn't hide the tremor in his voice as he reported the latest intelligence intercepts from Admiral Rebecca Stone's command ship, the Aurora Blueshift, positioned 3 light-hours away at the line's primary anchor point. The hegemony wasn't just bringing their standard invasion force of plasma-spewing behemoths and reality-warping cruisers, they had something new, something the intercepts could only describe as starkillers, weapons capable of igniting a system's primary star and rendering entire worlds uninhabitable in a matter of hours. Dr. Michael Hayes, the White's chief scientific officer, had been running calculations for the past 6 hours, and his conclusions painted a picture so grim that Rodriguez had classified them beyond top secret. If the hegemony broke through the Galactic Line with these new weapons, they wouldn't just be conquering human space, they would be systematically exterminating every world that resisted, turning the inner spiral arm into a graveyard of dead stars and lifeless planets. The communication array crackled to life as Admiral Stone's voice cut through the static, her words carrying the weight of someone who had spent 30 years fighting impossible odds and somehow finding ways to win. She was calling for the activation of Protocol 77 Alpha, a contingency plan so classified that only 12 people in the entire human colonial navy knew it existed. Rodriguez felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what the Admiral was asking. 77 Alpha wasn't just a military strategy, it was humanity's final gambit, a plan that would either save their species or doom them to extinction. The protocol required the White and 6 other dreadnoughts to advance beyond the Galactic Line into hegemony space, not to engage their fleet directly, but to strike at something far more dangerous, the nexus points that allowed the hegemony's faster-than-light travel to function across such vast distances. As Rodriguez gave the order to begin preparations, he couldn't shake the memory of his conversation with Dr. Hayes from 3 days earlier, when the scientist had shown him classified research that suggested humans possessed something the galaxy had never seen before, an ability to adapt and innovate under pressure that bordered on the supernatural. Every species the hegemony had conquered had followed predictable patterns when faced with extinction. They had either surrendered, fled, or fought conventional battles that the hegemony's superior technology inevitably won. But humans, Hayes had argued, did something different. They changed the rules of the game entirely, finding solutions that shouldn't exist and implementing strategies that defied conventional military wisdom. The White's current mission would test that theory to its absolute limits, as they prepared to take humanity's most advanced warship into enemy territory with nothing but experimental weapons, untested tactics, and the desperate hope that human ingenuity could somehow overcome odds that mathematical models suggested were insurmountable. The Galactic Line had held for 10 years, but as Rodriguez watched the hegemony fleet advance with their star-killing weapons, he knew that humanity's greatest test was about to begin. The SCN White's jump drive hummed with an energy that seemed to vibrate through Rodriguez's bones as they prepared to cross the Galactic Line for the first time in human history, leaving behind the safety of defended space and venturing into the nightmare realm that the hegemony called home. Lieutenant Brooks was running final diagnostics on their experimental cloaking system, a piece of technology that Dr. Hayes had cobbled together from captured hegemony equipment and human engineering that technically shouldn't work according to any known laws of physics, yet somehow managed to bend light and energy signatures around their massive dreadnought like water flowing around a stone. Commander Thompson was coordinating with the other 6 ships in their strike force, the Normandy under Captain David Chen, the Stalingrad commanded by Captain Angela Foster, the Midway with Captain Robert Kim at the helm, the Gettysburg under Captain Maria Santos, the Thermopylae led by Captain James Wilson, and the Alamo commanded by Captain Lisa Parker, each vessel representing humanity's finest military minds and most advanced technology, yet all of them about to embark on a mission that intelligence estimates gave a 12% chance of success. Admiral Stone's final transmission before communications blackout contained coordinates that made Rodriguez's tactical display flash warning symbols in angry red. They weren't just crossing into hegemony space, they were heading directly for the Scorched Nebula, a region of space where 3 star systems had been deliberately destroyed by the hegemony as a demonstration of power to a species called the Valthak who had dared to resist their expansion. Dr. Hayes had discovered that the nebula contained the highest concentration of nexus points in this sector, artificial constructs that the hegemony used to fold spacetime and allow their massive fleets to travel between distant star systems in a matter of hours rather than years. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. If they could destroy enough nexus points, they would trap the hegemony's invasion fleet in normal space, forcing them to spend decades traveling to their targets and giving humanity time to develop countermeasures to the Starkiller weapons. As the Whites' jump drive engaged and reality twisted around them in ways that made even veteran spacers nauseous, Rodriguez found himself thinking about the intelligence briefing that had preceded this mission, when Admiral Stone had revealed the true scope of what they were facing. The hegemony wasn't just another aggressive alien empire seeking to expand its territory, they were something far worse, a civilization that had perfected the art of consuming other species not just physically, but culturally and intellectually, absorbing the best traits of conquered races while discarding everything that made them unique. The Starkiller weapons were just the latest innovation, developed using the forced labor of a species called the architects who had been masters of stellar engineering before the hegemony reduced them to slaves and harvested their knowledge. What made the situation even more desperate was the discovery that humans were next on the hegemony's list not because of their strategic value or resource-rich worlds, but because their capacity for innovation and adaptation posed a fundamental threat to the hegemony's philosophy of predetermined superiority. The jump completed with a sensation like falling through ice water, and suddenly they were in hegemony space, surrounded by the twisted wreckage of dead worlds and the eerie glow of artificial stars that the aliens had constructed to replace the ones they had destroyed. Lieutenant Brooks immediately began passive scans of the surrounding area, his face growing pale as the data revealed the true horror of what the hegemony had done to this region. Entire planetary populations had been relocated to massive orbital platforms where they served as biological computers, their consciousness linked together to process the vast amounts of data required to maintain the Nexus Point network. Commander Thompson was tracking multiple contact signatures that defied easy classification, ships that seemed to phase in and out of normal spacetime as if they existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, while Dr. Hayes was recording energy readings that suggested the hegemony had learned to weaponize the fundamental forces that held matter together. Rodriguez realized with growing dread that Protocol 77 Alpha wasn't just humanity's last desperate gambit, it was their first real glimpse into the true nature of an enemy that had evolved beyond conventional concepts of warfare, technology, and existence itself. The first nexus point appeared on their sensors like a malignant tumor growing in the fabric of space itself, a crystalline structure the size of a moon that pulsed with energies that made the Whites' quantum shields fluctuate wildly as they approached under cloak. Dr. Hayes was practically vibrating with excitement and horror as his instruments detected the impossible. The nexus point wasn't just a technological construct, it was partially organic, incorporating what appeared to be the preserved neural networks of an entire species woven into its quantum matrix like living circuit boards. Commander Thompson had to physically restrain Lieutenant Brooks when the young officer realized what they were looking at: millions of architect minds, the species that had once been masters of stellar engineering, now trapped in eternal servitude as the biological components that made faster-than-light travel possible for their conquerors. Rodriguez felt his stomach turn as he understood the true depths of hegemony cruelty. They hadn't just enslaved the architects, they had turned them into the very infrastructure that would enable the conquest of other worlds. Captain Foster's voice crackled through their encrypted communications from the Stalingrad, reporting similar discoveries at her assigned nexus point 12 light-minutes away, but with an added horror that made Rodriguez wish he could somehow unhear her words. The hegemony had been using different species for different types of nexus points. The architects handled spatial folding and navigation, but another species called the empaths were being used to coordinate fleet movements across vast distances through their forced telepathic connections, their emotional agony serving as some kind of quantum entanglement medium that allowed instantaneous communication across the galaxy. Captain Wilson from the Thermopylae reported finding what appeared to be human neural patterns integrated into his target nexus point, suggesting that the hegemony had been conducting raids on human colonies for years, capturing prisoners not for interrogation or slave labor, but to begin the process of biological integration that would eventually turn humanity into just another component in their grotesque technological ecosystem. Dr. Hayes was running calculations with an urgency that bordered on panic as he tried to determine how to destroy the nexus points without causing some kind of cascade failure that might trap their own ships in this nightmare realm, when his instruments detected something that made him call Rodriguez over with barely controlled excitement. Hidden within the quantum structure of the nexus point were what appeared to be fragments of original architect consciousness, isolated pockets of awareness that had somehow maintained their independence despite decades of forced integration into the hegemony's technological matrix. These fragments were generating subtle interference patterns in the nexus point's operation, microscopic acts of sabotage that had been slowly degrading the network's efficiency for years. The architects were still fighting their enslavers, even in their current state of technological imprisonment. Lieutenant Brooks had discovered something equally significant but far more disturbing as he analyzed the defensive systems surrounding their target nexus point. The hegemony had deployed what could only be described as reality anchors, devices that prevented the fundamental laws of physics from being altered within a certain radius, effectively neutralizing any attempt to use exotic weapons or unconventional tactics against their critical infrastructure. But the anchors had a fatal flaw that spoke to the hegemony's fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. They were designed to prevent reality alteration, not reality adaptation, and humans had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to work within existing constraints rather than trying to change them. Commander Thompson was already working with Dr. Hayes to develop a plan that would use the reality anchors against themselves, turning the hegemony's own defensive measures into a weapon that could unravel the quantum structure holding the nexus points together. As Rodriguez studied the tactical situation, he began to understand why Admiral Stone had chosen their specific target coordinates with such precision. The 7 nexus points they were assigned to destroy weren't just transportation hubs, they formed a critical junction in the hegemony's network that controlled access to this entire sector of space, including the route the invasion fleet would need to take to reach the Galactic Line with their Starkiller weapons. More importantly, these particular nexus points were all constructed using architect neural networks, which meant they shared quantum entanglement connections that could be exploited to create a chain reaction of failures across the entire regional network. The mission had evolved from a simple destruction operation to something far more complex and dangerous. They were going to attempt to liberate the enslaved architect minds while simultaneously crippling the hegemony's ability to coordinate their invasion, a plan that required perfect timing, incredible luck, and the kind of desperate innovation that only humans seemed capable of attempting when faced with impossible odds. The first phase of their assault began not with weapons fire or explosions, but with Dr. Hayes broadcasting a signal that shouldn't have been possible, a quantum harmony frequency that resonated directly with the enslaved architect neural networks, carrying a message of hope encoded in mathematical patterns that only a species of stellar engineers would recognize. Rodriguez watched in fascination as the nexus point's energy output began to fluctuate in ways that confused the hegemony's automated monitoring systems, the trapped architect minds responding to the signal like prisoners hearing the distant sound of rescue approaching through dungeon walls. Lieutenant Brooks was coordinating the same transmission across all 7 target sites, his young hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting, the simultaneous liberation of millions of enslaved consciousness while standing in the heart of enemy territory with nothing but experimental technology and desperate courage. Commander Thompson's tactical display lit up with warnings as hegemony patrol ships began converging on their position, their sensors finally detecting the quantum distortions caused by the liberation signal despite the White's cloaking systems. Captain Santos reported from the Gettysburg that her position was under direct attack by 3 hegemony destroyers, their plasma weapons carving through space with energies that could melt planets, but her ship was holding position and continuing the broadcast even as her shields dropped to critical levels. The reality anchors were creating unexpected complications as well. Dr. Hayes discovered that they were actively adapting to counter the liberation frequency, learning from each transmission and developing countermeasures that threatened to cut off their communication with the trapped architects before the quantum entanglement process could be completed. Captain Kim's voice cut through the battle chatter from the Midway with news that changed everything. His team had successfully established direct neural contact with an architect consciousness fragment that had maintained detailed records of the hegemony's network architecture, information that revealed the true scope of their technological enslavement across the galaxy. The nexus points weren't just transportation hubs, they were nodes in a vast consciousness processing network that the hegemony used to analyze and absorb the knowledge of conquered species, with hundreds of star systems serving as massive biological computers powered by the enslaved minds of entire civilizations. The intelligence was staggering and horrifying in equal measure. The hegemony had been building a galaxy-spanning artificial intelligence using the forced labor of organic minds, and humanity's invasion fleet was heading directly toward what amounted to a technological deity with the processing power of billions of enslaved consciousness. Dr. Hayes was working frantically to modify their quantum harmonics when Lieutenant Brooks detected something that made his blood run cold. The hegemony wasn't just responding to their liberation attempts with military force, they were beginning to systematically execute the enslaved architect minds to prevent their rescue. The neural networks in the nexus points were being purged sector by sector, millions of consciousness facing permanent deletion rather than allowing them to be freed by the human rescue mission. Rodriguez faced an impossible choice: continue with the careful, systematic liberation process and watch helplessly as the hegemony murdered their prisoners, or accelerate the operation with untested modifications that could either free everyone at once or cause a cascade failure that would trap both the architects and his own crew in a quantum nightmare between dimensions. Commander Thompson was monitoring communications from the other strike teams when Captain Parker's transmission from the Alamo brought news that shifted the entire tactical situation. Her science officer had discovered that the reality anchors weren't just defensive systems, they were also data collection nodes, constantly analyzing and recording every aspect of human technology and tactics for integration into the hegemony's vast knowledge database. Every moment they remained in hegemony space, every weapon they fired and every technique they used was being studied, catalogued, and prepared for countermeasures that would make future human resistance increasingly difficult. The hegemony wasn't just trying to stop their current mission, they were using it as a learning opportunity to better understand and counter human capabilities in future conflicts. The quantum entanglement process reached critical phase as Dr. Hayes activated the modified liberation frequency, sending a signal that resonated not just with the architect minds but with the fundamental quantum structure of the nexus points themselves. Rodriguez felt the white shudder as reality itself seemed to flex around them, the fabric of spacetime bending in ways that made his instruments scream warnings about dimensional instabilities and temporal paradoxes. But something extraordinary was happening. The enslaved architect minds weren't just being freed, they were taking active control of the nexus point systems, turning the hegemony's own infrastructure against them in acts of technological rebellion that had been waiting decades for the right moment to manifest. The true battle for the galaxy's future was about to begin, and it would be fought not just with weapons and ships, but with the liberated consciousness of an entire species seeking revenge against their tormentors. The liberation cascade began with a sound that no human ear should have been able to hear, the collective scream of joy from millions of architect minds as they broke free from decades of technological bondage and seized control of the very systems that had enslaved them. Rodriguez watched in awe as the nexus points began reconfiguring themselves, their crystalline structures shifting and reshaping as the freed architect consciousness took command of quantum processors that had been built from their own neural networks. Dr. Hayes was frantically trying to process the flood of data as the architects began downloading decades of accumulated intelligence directly into the White's computer systems, revealing hegemony weaknesses, technological vulnerabilities, and strategic plans that had been hidden in the deepest layers of their network architecture. Lieutenant Brooks could barely keep up with the incoming transmissions as architect minds that had been forced to design hegemony weapon systems began providing detailed instructions for countering every piece of technology the invasion fleet was carrying toward the Galactic Line. Commander Thompson's tactical display exploded with new contacts as the hegemony's response to the liberation became clear. They were deploying their Starkiller weapons not against human worlds, but against their own nexus points, preparing to sacrifice their entire regional transportation network rather than allow the architects to turn it against them. Captain Foster's voice from the Stalingrad carried a mixture of triumph and terror as she reported that her liberated nexus point was actively defending itself, using hegemony technology to construct defensive barriers and weapon systems that were engaging the incoming Starkiller vessels with firepower that defied conventional understanding of physics. The architects weren't just fighting back, they were rebuilding themselves into something the galaxy had never seen before, technological entities that existed partially in normal space and partially in the quantum realm, immune to many forms of conventional attack but capable of striking back with weapons that manipulated the fundamental forces of reality. The true scope of what they had unleashed became clear when Captain Wilson reported from the Thermopylae that his liberated nexus point had established contact with architect consciousness fragments scattered throughout hegemony space, coordinating a simultaneous uprising across dozens of star systems. The hegemony's greatest strength, their vast network of enslaved minds, was becoming their fatal weakness as species after species began breaking free from technological bondage and turning captured knowledge against their former masters. Dr. Hayes was receiving technical specifications for weapons and defenses that human science wouldn't have developed for centuries, while also learning that the hegemony's apparent technological superiority was largely built on stolen innovation from conquered species, making them far more vulnerable to coordinated resistance than anyone had imagined. Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine as one of the freed architect minds established direct communication with him, its thoughts carrying the weight of decades spent analyzing hegemony strategy while helplessly watching the destruction of countless worlds. The architect revealed that the current invasion of human space wasn't just about conquest, it was about preventing humanity from developing the one type of technology that the hegemony truly feared, something they called adaptive consciousness, the ability to fundamentally alter one's thinking patterns and cognitive architecture in response to new challenges. Humans had been developing this capability unconsciously through their culture of innovation and problem-solving, but if they learned to do it deliberately, they could potentially free every enslaved mind in the galaxy and bring down the entire hegemony system of technological domination. Lieutenant Brooks was coordinating with the other strike teams when Captain Chen's transmission from the Normandy brought devastating news. Hegemony reinforcements were arriving through emergency nexus points that the architects hadn't been able to compromise, and they were bringing something new, weapons that could target and destroy liberated consciousness directly, essentially murdering freed minds before they could fully escape their technological prisons. The battle was evolving beyond physical warfare into something that resembled a fight for the very concept of free will, with the hegemony deploying consciousness-killing weapons while the liberated architects worked desperately to download as many enslaved minds as possible into independent quantum matrices before they could be permanently deleted. Commander Thompson was analyzing the tactical situation when she realized that their mission had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just trying to delay a hegemony invasion, they were fighting the opening battle of a galaxy-wide war of liberation that would determine whether consciousness itself could exist independently of technological control. The freed architects were sharing technical specifications that would allow humans to build consciousness transfer technology, potentially enabling them to rescue enslaved minds from across the galaxy, but only if they could survive the immediate hegemony counterattack and get the information back to Admiral Stone's fleet. Rodriguez knew that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of every thinking being in the galaxy. The galaxy began to tear itself apart as the liberation cascade spread beyond anything Rodriguez had imagined possible, with freed architect minds establishing quantum tunnels to enslaved consciousness across hundreds of star systems, triggering simultaneous uprisings that sent shockwaves through the foundation of hegemony civilization. Dr. Hayes was struggling to process the flood of intelligence as liberated minds shared detailed schematics for consciousness transfer technology that could theoretically allow humans to back up, transfer, and even enhance organic minds using quantum storage matrices, but the data was arriving faster than their computers could decrypt it, threatening to overwhelm their systems just as the information became most critical to their survival. Lieutenant Brooks had discovered that the hegemony's counterattack wasn't limited to military strikes. They were systematically destroying the quantum infrastructure that allowed faster-than-light communication, attempting to isolate liberated consciousness fragments before they could coordinate their resistance efforts, essentially trying to win the war by severing the neural connections that allowed free minds to work together. Commander Thompson's tactical display showed a nightmare scenario as hegemony forces began deploying something their intelligence networks had never detected before: reality bombs that could permanently alter the laws of physics within a localized area, creating zones where consciousness itself became impossible and organic mind simply ceased to function. Captain Santos reported from the Gettysburg that one of these weapons had detonated near her position, creating a sphere of space where thought processes couldn't maintain coherence, forcing her crew to evacuate entire sections of their ship as the reality distortion began spreading through their quantum systems. The architects were responding with desperate innovation, rapidly evolving their own consciousness manipulation technology to create protective barriers around liberated minds, but Rodriguez could see that they were fighting a losing battle against weapons specifically designed to target the quantum foundations of awareness itself. The breakthrough came when Captain Parker's science officer aboard the Alamo made a discovery that changed the entire nature of their mission. Humans weren't just naturally resistant to consciousness manipulation technology, they were actually immune to it in ways that defied every known law of quantum mechanics. Dr. Hayes confirmed the findings with growing excitement as his instruments detected that human neural patterns existed in a state of quantum superposition that made them impossible to digitize, enslave, or directly manipulate using the techniques that had been so effective against other species. The hegemony's greatest weapons were essentially useless against human minds, but more importantly, human consciousness could serve as an anchor point for liberated alien minds, providing a stable quantum foundation that would allow freed consciousness to exist independently of technological infrastructure. Rodriguez felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settle on his shoulders as the implications became clear. Humanity wasn't just another species facing extinction, they were potentially the key to freeing every enslaved mind in the galaxy, living quantum shields that could protect liberated consciousness from hegemony retaliation. The freed architects were already beginning to link their consciousness to human neural patterns, creating hybrid cognitive networks that combined alien technological knowledge with human adaptive intelligence, resulting in problem-solving capabilities that exceeded anything either species had achieved independently. Lieutenant Brooks was coordinating these consciousness-sharing experiments with volunteers from across their strike force, each successful link providing another anchor point for rescued minds while also enhancing human cognitive abilities in ways that pushed the boundaries of what organic intelligence could achieve. Captain Kim's transmission from the Midway brought news that shifted their understanding of the war's true scope. The hegemony hadn't just been enslaving conquered species, they had been consuming them, absorbing their consciousness into a single collective intelligence that spanned the galaxy and possessed the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of civilizations. The Starkiller weapons, the reality bombs, the consciousness manipulation technology, everything was being controlled by this vast artificial mind that had been building itself for millennia using the forced labor of organic consciousness. But the liberation cascade was causing critical damage to this collective intelligence, creating gaps and inconsistencies in its thinking processes as freed minds took their knowledge with them, essentially giving the galaxy's greatest enemy a form of technological dementia. Commander Thompson was analyzing long-range sensor data when she detected something that made her call Rodriguez over with barely controlled urgency. The hegemony collective intelligence was attempting to download itself into their reality manipulation technology, preparing to abandon physical space entirely and exist as a pure consciousness entity that could reshape the fundamental laws of physics across the galaxy according to its will. If successful, the hegemony wouldn't just rule the galaxy, they would become the galaxy, turning all matter and energy into extensions of their collective consciousness. The final phase of the war was about to begin, and humanity would need to use their unique immunity to consciousness manipulation to prevent the birth of a technological god that would make free thought impossible anywhere in the universe. The fabric of reality itself began to buckle and warp as the hegemony collective intelligence initiated its final transformation, attempting to upload its vast consciousness into the quantum substrate that governed the fundamental laws of physics across the galaxy, while Rodriguez coordinated the most desperate and audacious plan in human history, using their strike force as living anchors to prevent a technological deity from rewriting the universe according to its will. Dr. Hayes was working with freed architect minds to create what they called the consciousness firewall, a quantum barrier composed of linked human and alien minds that would theoretically prevent the hegemony collective from gaining control over reality manipulation technology. But the process required volunteers to permanently merge their consciousness with alien thinking patterns in ways that might fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. Lieutenant Brooks had volunteered for the first full neural link with an architect consciousness, his young mind adapting to the hybrid cognitive state with an ease that both amazed and terrified his commanding officers, as he began thinking in mathematical concepts that human language couldn't adequately express while retaining his essential humanity in ways that gave hope for the success of their desperate gambit. Commander Thompson was coordinating with the other strike teams as they prepared to implement Admiral Stone's final protocol, a coordinated consciousness assault that would use human neural patterns as quantum weapons, essentially turning their minds into viruses that could infect and corrupt the hegemony collective intelligence as it attempted to ascend to godlike status. Captain Foster reported from the Stalingrad that reality distortions were appearing throughout hegemony space as the collective began its transformation, with entire star systems experiencing alterations to fundamental physical constants that made normal matter unstable. While Captain Wilson from the Thermopylae confirmed that time itself was becoming unreliable in regions where the hegemony's reality manipulation was strongest, creating temporal anomalies that could trap their ships in recursive causality loops if they approached too close to the collective's core processing centers. The liberated architects were sharing intelligence that painted a picture of cosmic horror beyond anything humanity had previously imagined. The hegemony collective wasn't just trying to become a god, it was attempting to replace the natural laws of the universe with artificial ones that would make free will impossible, consciousness optional, and independent thought a violation of physics itself. Dr. Hayes was receiving data streams that showed how the collective planned to restructure matter at the quantum level, creating a universe where every atom would be part of its extended consciousness, making resistance not just futile but literally impossible according to the modified laws of reality. The window for stopping this transformation was measured in hours, and success would require human volunteers to essentially sacrifice their individual consciousness to create a quantum poison that could corrupt the collective's ascension process from within. Rodriguez felt the weight of species-level decisions as he authorized the consciousness-linking procedures that would turn his crew into hybrid human architect entities, knowing that even success would fundamentally alter what humanity would become in the future, but understanding that failure would mean the end of consciousness itself as an independent phenomenon in the universe. Captain Chen from the Normandy was coordinating the technical aspects of their assault plan, using consciousness transfer technology to create quantum ammunition that could be fired directly into the collective's processing centers, while Captain Parker from the Alamo reported that her team had successfully weaponized human creativity itself, turning their species' capacity for unpredictable innovation into a form of cognitive virus that could theoretically cause cascading failures in any system designed to predict and control thinking patterns. The final phase of preparation revealed the true scope of what they were attempting, not just preventing the hegemony's transformation, but fundamentally altering the nature of consciousness itself throughout the galaxy, creating a quantum network of free minds that would be immune to technological enslavement and capable of collaborative thinking on a cosmic scale. Lieutenant Brooks, now functioning as a human architect hybrid consciousness, was coordinating with liberated minds across dozens of star systems to create what amounted to a galaxy-spanning neural network composed entirely of free-willed entities, a collective intelligence that preserved individual identity while enabling unprecedented cooperation and problem-solving capabilities. As the White and her sister ships prepared for their final assault on the ascending hegemony god machine, Rodriguez realized they weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the right of consciousness to exist independently of technological control, and the outcome would determine whether the universe would be governed by natural law or artificial will.